Wrath of Aeon is a mixed bag of emotions for me. It's a Quake-like boom shoot published by 3D Realms around 2019, and similar to how Ion Fury uses an updated version of a late 90s shooter engine, Wrath does the same thing, but in this case it's Dark Places, which if you didn't know is one of the better forks of Quake before that re-release came out. Wrath does look a lot better environmentally speaking than Quake's re-release, at least when they're trying. It's still chunky like Quake, but some of the set pieces like this snowy area in level 3 look nice. The game starts out on a boat sailing inland. Man, I'm getting some deja vu. There is this guy that calls me an Outlander, which I can vibe with because it makes me feel like I'm playing Morrowind. What is going on? The first weapon you're given is this cool arm sword. I vibe with it. Most retro-styled boom shooters have this gimmick that'll sell you on the game, and Wrath's gimmick is this arm sword. It has an alt fire that propels the character forward, and it can be used to get longer jumps, and in some cases, it can even give you a slight vertical boost. You think something like this would allow some cool sequence breaking? Something like a dust sequence break, right? Well, no. I only found one sequence break in my entire time playing. I don't even know if that was a sequence break, it just didn't feel like that's how I was supposed to get here. You might think that this rinky-dink sword isn't powerful, but you'd be mistaken. I'm pretty sure this arm sword can one-shot most enemies. I'm also introduced to the save system for Wrath within this little tutorial area. It's odd. So the way it works is you pick up what's called a soul tether, and it acts as an inventory item that you can activate at any time to save your game by pressing F2. So my first thought was that I was going to have to resource manage my saves and use them sparingly, but that really isn't the case. By the last level, I had over 20 soul tethers left in stock, and additionally there are shrines placed all over the levels to save your game and restore your health completely. And most of the times after I would pop a soul tether, I would find a shrine right around the corner. So the saves that are baked into the levels are seemingly pretty well paced, so you don't even need the soul tethers at the end of the day. I'm not even good at video games. I think this game is just easy. One weird thing about the saves though are how they freeze the game. It's the only time I've seen the game freeze, but I think it's worth a mention. If you would like to completely forego this Daikatana-ass save system for something a little more rooted in boom shoot 'em, you can just turn off the soul tethers, and then you get normal quick saves. Most of the difficulty, at least for me, arose from the enemies spawning either behind me in an area that I had just cleared out, or enemies cross-mapping me from somewhere in heaven. Enemy encounters in this game, especially in the latter half, are pretty intense. Lots of fast-moving projectiles and enemies that explode when they die. It's a Quake-like, so it's only natural that you'd be forced to stay mobile. Maybe too mobile, though. I don't know if the AI of these guys is really dumb at times, but and there was also this. This guy right here, the guy with the big eyeball, shoots a really stupidly fast-moving projectile, and he can detect you from an entire map away, it seems like. And more often than not, they get stacked on top of each other 3 at a time, so you have to jump rope with them, which really isn't a problem. It's fine when you're in an open arena, but it becomes a problem when they put you in a small corridor where you literally can't avoid the projectiles. On the topic of enemies in general, there are only like 7 in the first episode, and there are 5 levels in this episode, and they each take about an hour. So let's put it like this. Quake in its entirety has 15 enemies and is a 2-hour long game. Episode 1 of Wrath alone is 5 hours and only has like 7 enemies. If this sounds like it's not a very conducive setup for enemy variety, you'd be right. The thing that bothered me the most though is the lack of an actual soundtrack. Like there is one and it's done by Andrew Hulshult, but there isn't a super metal kick-ass soundtrack that plays during arena encounters, which makes me feel like the game is less impactful in some sections. It got to the point where my brain was so desperate for music that my mind started registering the metronome of plasma shots as a soundtrack, which might have been intentional now that I'm thinking about it and saying it out loud, but I don't know. I'm in episode 1's hub area now. It's called Morningvale, and I like the setup Ironworks wants to go for here. You're allowed to play the levels in any order you would like, which you might think is a bad idea because obviously there would be levels that are harder than others that you should do first. But no, these levels are scaled in difficulty depending on how many you've completed up until that point, which makes sense because I couldn't imagine doing some of these arenas with just a pistol and a sword. The first level I tackled was the Undercrofts. This revolver shoots slugs. I mean, it makes sense. I was using this thing through the whole game. It's a decent option for long range, and it has a pretty punchy sound. It also has this alt fire that can fire all 3 slugs at once. It can one-shot most low-tier enemies. I don't use it much, though. I do use the shotgun's alt fire frequently, however. It's a charge-up that shoots exploding shells? I'm not sure. It's good for dispatching higher tier enemies at a distance though. It's also just a fun shotgun to use, very punchy, very powerful, no RNG based bullshit damage. It's just good stuff all around, I reckon. The level starts me out in, well, an Undercroft, but quickly transitions into a snowy cathedral setting, which is only reused slightly in a later level, which is pretty impressive considering how big these levels are. It takes about an hour to complete each level in episode 1, so just for reference, these levels are kind of big. So there's these keys you can find, and they're called coffer keys, and they're in every level, several of them in fact, and they can be used to open various different coffer chests strewn across these giant maps. These chests contain some extra loot that I think most players will find helpful. You remember the nail gun from Quake? This is that. Highly effective piece of artillery here, and it's got loads of ammo pickup opportunities, so you'll never really need to worry about not having access to it. It's great at dispatching these sludge creatures and glorified lost souls. Mini boss time! I was pretty confused when I had been given all these weapons in the first level, but then this arena right here made it make sense. Winning this fight rewards you with the Retcher, which I think is supposed to be a step-in for a grenade launcher. You can lay down cysts, which are supposed to act as landmines. They aren't very effective though. The weapon is much better used for sniping low-tier enemies. Very cool weapon design. It reminds me of that one gun from the 2006 version of Prey. This game does power-ups differently than most. They're called relics, and they act as inventory items as well. There's this purple relic that I used a bunch that aggroes enemies against each other if they walk into the area of effect, and I used this one mainly to deal with Diddy's souls. The only other two I used were a stationary shield, which I only found useful in the final boss, and this one that makes you invincible at the cost of your health. I think if you're going to play this game and use the relics to their maximum potential, I think it would make the game a lot easier than it is otherwise. Like the one I was just using that absorbs health on kill is kind of like a Tomb of Power Necromancer gauntlet from Heretic, except it's a little worse because it's not absorbing health based on DPS, it's absorbing health based on kills. Which at first glance probably makes this power up not seem as appealing until you realize how insane it is to pair this with the Blade of Ruination, because this thing literally just one-shots most enemies, and even if an enemy explodes when you kill it because you're this close to it and take damage, you're going to absorb more health from that enemy than you take from its explosion. So it just makes sense that if you're in a tight situation to use the Blade of Ruination alt fire and pop one of these soul essence absorber things. Like all the levels, this one ends with you picking up a relic? Really? You couldn't have found a different name for it? You need 5 of these relics to get to the boss of each episode. In level 3, I got this ore cannon, which is a pretty strong weapon, and it sounds pretty cool. It sucks though, because it barely gets any ammo drops. See, the way that the rest of the weapons work is you find them, and then there's a new enemy introduced that drops their ammo type, and also that weapon's ammo starts spawning in the game. The ore cannon ammo barely spawns, and there isn't an enemy that drops ammo for the damn thing. Well, there is, but it barely spawned for me after I got the ore cannon. At least in episode 1, which is all I've played so far. Talking about individual levels for this game is almost pointless. There are a lot of samey copy-pasted looking areas. Specifically this design that appears in the first Undercroft, this boring sewer-like design, is about in every level, with the only variation being small set pieces like this decrepit looking fortification setup in level 5. But even this has a similar looking set piece used earlier in the swamp level, which ended up being my level 2. The size of these maps is impressive, but the variation of the set pieces and where they take place is not that impressive. Want to see what a lame-ass boss fight looks like? The final boss, at least in episode 1, is a boring, stationary Quake 1 episode 1-like boss. But unlike the Quake boss fight, there isn't really an oppressing ambiance or an adrenaline-filled score like Doom to complement the fight. All around, I was pretty disappointed with the boss fight. I died like 3 times, but I feel like I died more because of how fast tracking is on some of these attacks, less because I was actually being challenged or this was an interesting boss fight. It felt cheap when I died, okay? Overall, I would say the Wrath is a decent boom shoot. I definitely think it's an easy sell to anyone interested in such a thing. It's not as fun as something like Dusk, but, well, actually, I don't have anything else to say.